Hello, friends. Welcome back. It's our second night with Dr. Zhivago, and I'm excited about it. We left Europe offering up a prayer about his mother and feeling guilty about not praying for his dad. I'm glad you're here. Enjoy. In a second-class compartment of the train, which had stopped in the field across the river, sat Misha Gordon, who was traveling with his father, a lawyer from Orenburg. Misha was a boy of 11 with a thoughtful face and big dark eyes. He was in his second form at school. His father, Grigory Osipovich Gordon, was being transferred to a new post in Moscow. His mother and sisters were already there, arranging the flat. Misha and his father had been traveling for 3 days. Russia, with its fields, steppes, villages, and towns, bleached lime white by the sun, flew past them, wrapped in hot clouds of dust. Lines of carts stretched along the roads. They lumbered aside at the level crossings, and, from the furiously speeding train, it seemed as if the carts stood still and the horses were marking time. At big stations, the passengers jumped out and ran helter-skelter to the buffet. The sun, setting behind the station garden, lit up their feet and the wheels of the train. All the movements in the world, taken separately, were sober and deliberate, but, taken together, they were all happily drunk with the general flow of life which united and carried them. People worked and struggled. They were driven on by their individual cares and anxieties. But these springs of action would have run down and jammed the mechanism if they had not been kept in check by an overall feeling of profound unconcern. This feeling came from the comforting awareness of the interwovenness of all human lives, the sense of their flowing into one another, the happy assurance that all that happened in the world took place not only on the earth, which buried the dead, but also on some other level, known to some as the kingdom of God, to others as history, and yet to others by some other name. From this general rule, the boy, Misha, felt himself to be a bitterly unfortunate exception. Anxiety was his mainspring, and no such unconcern as the rest of the world shared, relieved, and ennobled him. He knew this hereditary trait in himself and watched for it with a morbid self-consciousness. It distressed and humiliated him. For as long as he could remember, he had never ceased to wonder how it was that a human being with arms and legs like everyone else, and with a language and way of life common to all the rest, could be so different, a being liked by so few and loved by no one. He could not understand how it was that if you were worse than other people, you could not improve yourself by trying. What did it mean to be a Jew? What was the purpose of it? What was the reward or the justification of this unarmed challenge, which brought nothing but grief? When he took his problem to his father, he was told that his premises were absurd. He must not argue like that, but he was offered no solution deep enough to attract him or to make him bow silently to the inevitable. And making an exception only for his parents, he gradually became contemptuous of all the grown-ups who had made this mess and were quite unable to clear it up. He was quite sure that when he was big, he would straighten it all out. For instance, no one could suggest that his father should not have run after that lunatic when he rushed out into the corridor, or that he should not have stopped the train when the man pushed him aside, flung open the door, and threw himself head first out of the express like a diver leaping from a springboard into a swimming pool. Yet now that the train had been stuck for ages, the fact that it was not just anyone but precisely Grigory Osipovich who had pulled the communication cord made it seem that the hold-up and the whole annoying business had been caused by the Gordon family. No one knew for certain why there was such a long delay. Some said that the sudden stoppage had damaged the pneumatic brakes, others that the train had stopped on a steep gradient and the engine could not take it without getting up speed. A third view was that as the suicide was a well-known person, his lawyer, who had been with him on the train, had insisted on officials being called from the nearest station, Kologrevovka, so that a sworn statement could be drawn up. This was why the driver's mate had climbed up the telegraph pole. The inspection trolley bringing the officials should now be on its way. There was a faint stench from the lavatories, not quite neutralized by eau de cologne, and a smell of fried chicken, a little high and wrapped in dirty grease-stained paper. As if nothing had happened, graying Petersburg ladies with wheezy, chesty voices, who had been turned into gypsies by the combination of soot and cosmetics, powdered their faces and wiped their fingers on their handkerchiefs. When, with a coquettish wriggle of their shoulders for which the narrow passage offered an excuse, they passed the Gordons' compartment, it seemed to Misha that through their pursed lips they must be hissing, "Gracious, what sensitive plants. They think they're a special creation. They're intellectuals. All this is too much for them." The body of the suicide lay on the grass by the side of the bank. Blood had streaked his forehead with a dark sign, as if crossing out his face. The dry blood did not look like his blood, but like something apart from him, a piece of sticking plaster or a streak of mud or a wet birch leaf. Knots of constantly changing onlookers and sympathizers surrounded him, while his friend and traveling companion, a thick-set, haughty lawyer who looked like a well-bred animal in a sweaty shirt, stood over him sullenly with an expressionless face. He was dying of heat and fanning himself with his hat. In answer to all questions, he shrugged his shoulders and said crossly, without even turning around, "He was an alcoholic. What can you expect? A typical consequence of DTs." Once or twice a thin old woman in a woolen dress and lace kerchief went up to the body. She was the widow of Tverzina, two of whose sons were engine drivers, and who was traveling third class on a free warrant with her 2 daughters-in-law. Like nuns with their mother superior, the 2 quiet women, their shawls pulled low over their foreheads, followed her in silence. The crowd made way for them. Tverzina's husband had been burned alive in a railway accident. She stood a little way away from the body, where she could see it through the crowd, and sighed as if comparing the 2 cases. "Each according to his fate," she seemed to say. "Some die by the Lord's will, but here's a fine kettle of fish, upon my soul, to die of rich living and derangement of the mind." All the passengers came out and had a look at the corpse, and only went back to their compartments for fear their belongings might get stolen. As they jumped out on the track and picked flowers or took a short walk to stretch their legs, they felt as if the whole place had only been brought into being by the halt, and that neither the squelchy marsh, nor the broad river, nor the fine house and church on the steep bank opposite would have existed, except for the accident. Even the sun, as it shone its evening light on the scene of the suicide, diffident like a cow from a nearby herd, came to take a look at the crowd. Seemed to be a stage prop, a purely local manifestation. Misha had been deeply shaken by the event, and had at first cried with shock and pity. In the course of the long journey, the man who was now dead had come several times to their compartment, and had talked for hours with Misha's father. He had said that he found relief in the moral decency, peace, and understanding which he discovered in him, and asked him endless questions about fine points of law concerning bills of exchange, deeds of settlement, bankruptcy, and fraud. "Well, I never," he exclaimed at Gordon's answers. "Is the law as merciful as that? My lawyer takes a much more gloomy view." Each time that this nervous wreck of a man calmed down, his traveling companion had come from their first-class coach to fetch him and drag him off to the restaurant car to drink champagne. This companion was the same thick-set, insolent, clean-shaven, and smartly dressed lawyer who now stood over his body, looking as if nothing could surprise him. It was hard to escape the feeling that his client's ceaseless agitation had somehow been to his advantage. Misha's father had told him that the suicide had been a well-known millionaire, Zhivago, a good-natured profligate, by then half out of his mind. Unrestrained by Misha's presence, the man had talked about his late wife and his son, a boy of Misha's age, and then about his second family, whom he had abandoned like the first. At this point he would remember something else, grow pale with terror, and begin to mumble and lose the thread of his story. To Misha he had shown an unaccountable affection, which probably reflected a feeling for someone else. He showered him with presents, jumping out to buy them at the big stations where the bookstalls of the first-class waiting rooms also sold toys and local curios. He had drunk incessantly and complained that he had not slept for 3 months, and that as soon as he sobered up, for however short a while, he suffered torments unimaginable to any normal human being. At the end, he had rushed into their compartment, seized Gordon by the hand, tried to tell him something but found he could not, and had dashed out into the corridor and thrown himself from the train. Now Misha was examining the small wooden box of Ural's minerals which had been the last gift of the dead man. Suddenly there was a general stir. A trolley rolled up on the parallel track. A doctor, 2 policemen, and a magistrate with a cockade in his hat jumped out. Questions were asked in cold business-like voices and notes taken. The policemen and the guards, slipping and sliding awkwardly in the sand, dragged the corpse up the embankment. A peasant woman started wailing. The passengers were asked to go back to their seats. The guard blew his whistle, and the train moved on. Here's old holy oil, Nicky thought savagely, looking round the room for a way of escape. The voice of the guests were outside the door, and retreat was cut off. The room had 2 beds, his own and Voskoboynikov's. With scarcely a moment's thought, he crept under the first. He could hear them calling and looking for him outside, surprised at his absence, and finally coming into the bedroom. "Well, it can't be helped," said Nikolai Nikolaevich. "Run along, Yura. Perhaps your friend will turn up later and you can play with him then." They sat talking about the student unrest in Petersburg and Moscow, keeping Nicky in his absurd and undignified confinement for close on half an hour. At last they went out on the veranda. Nicky softly opened the window, jumped out, and went off into the park. He had had no sleep the night before and was out of sorts. He was in his 14th year and was sick and tired of being a child. He had stayed awake all night and had gone out at dawn. The rising sun had cast the long dewy shadow of trees in loops over the parkland. The shadow was not black but dark gray, like soaked felt, and it was somehow this damp shadow on the ground, with strips of light in it like a girl's fingers, that the heady fragrance of the morning seemed to come. Suddenly, a streak of quicksilver, as shiny as the dew on the grass, flowed by him a few paces away. It flowed on, and the ground did not absorb it. Then, with an unexpectedly sharp movement, it swerved aside and hid. It was a grass snake. Nicky shivered. He had certain oddities of character. When he was excited, he talked aloud to himself, copying his mother's choice of lofty subjects and her taste for paradox. How wonderful to be alive, he thought, but why does it always have to be so painful? God exists, of course, but if he exists, then I am he. He looked up at an aspen, shaking from top to bottom, its wet leaves like bits of tin foil. I'll order it to stop. With an insane intensity of effort, he willed silently, with his whole being, with every ounce of his flesh and blood, "Be still!" And the tree at once obediently froze into immobility. Nicky laughed with joy. Excuse me. Nicky laughed with joy and ran off happily to the river to bathe.